Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues. Please note that this podcast was recorded on the 10th of October. In the interim, the Australian federal government has announced a significant expansion to their capacity investment scheme. Clare and the Aurora team will not comment on this as the expansion hadn't been announced at the time of recording.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in APAC. We're delighted today to be joined by Clare Savage, Chair of the Australian Energy Regulator. Clare's had a diverse and distinguished career in Australian energy, spending time at the Energy Security Board as Deputy Chair, the Business Council of Australia, EnergyAustralia, and the Australian Treasury, amongst other roles. The focus of today's discussion will be on regulation through the energy transition. Clare, welcome to Energy Unplugged. We're delighted you can join us.
Thanks, Hugo. Great to be here with you.
We're also joined today by James Ha, Australia's Head of Research in Australia. James, thanks for joining too.
Thanks, Hugo.
Before we get into the details of regulation in Australia, it'd be helpful to set the stage for our overseas listeners. Australia's federal government has set an ambitious target of 82% renewable penetration by 2030, up from about 35% today. But like a lot of markets, there are some challenges to faster build-out rates, spare network capacity and difficulties in building new transmission, rising capex for renewables and batteries. In the absence of carbon pricing or extension to green certificate programs, a potential lack of long-term price signals for new build renewables, challenges in closing down coal fleets rapidly while keeping reliability high, amongst many others. What do you see as the main challenges at present? And how do you think about prioritising them in your role?
Might make sense, Hugo, before we dive into that, to give your listeners a little bit of context around the Australian market itself, because it's obviously quite different to some of the markets around the world. And I'd probably start by saying it's not one market. So there's one state, Western Australia, which is in landmass size about the size of Western Europe, and it is entirely disconnected from the rest of the country. So we do not have any physical interconnection into Western Australia, and they tend to do their own thing. They have their own system. And so largely what I'll be talking about today is what we call the national electricity market, which doesn't include Western Australia, and it also doesn't include the Northern Territory. So it's just probably a little bit of context from that perspective. But the national electricity market, which does include the other states and territories, except for Western Australia and Northern Territory, has about 40,000 kilometres of transmission lines. So it's a really long, stringy system, is how we would describe it. So it doesn't have the really dense populations that you might see through other countries around the world that help to support, I guess, their cheaper or lower costs in terms of fixed costs for networks. There's probably about 204 terawatt hours across that 40,000 kilometres, which 65 gigawatts of installed capacity. And of that, probably 17 gigawatts of that is rooftop solar. So it's a really different system to what you're seeing in other countries around the world. And I just think it's worth probably starting with that physical challenge before we go to some of the issues you've talked about today. So at the moment, we probably produce about 60% in the national electricity market, 60% of our energy from coal. And that is down from sort of much higher numbers, 80, 90%, only sort of 10, 15 years ago. But 60%, and we're trying to get to 82% renewables by 2030. So that challenge and that transition across the next 6-7 years is going to be massive. And I think your question to me was, well, what do I think are some of the biggest challenges? It's like, how long have you got? And lucky we've got 40 minutes because we can talk about a lot of them. But I think the very first question, when you start to think about how do you get there, is how do you transition the generation fleet? So when you are starting with such a large amount of coal that's in the system, how do you get clear timetables and expectations around when coal's going to close? Because that's an important signal for new investment. How do we make sure that it's maintained so that it can deliver reliably until it does exit? Because that's another challenge, because we do rely upon that, reliable supply of coal while we are making the transition. And then how do you start to think about the replacement firming resources, so flexible resources, and what do they look like? And then obviously the big investment in renewables, so solar and wind in particular, and increasingly offshore wind. You know, we think we're going to need probably 9 times the amount of grid-scale wind and solar that we've got at the moment. We're going to have to build another 10,000 kilometres of transmission. So that in and of itself is a big challenge. We have a huge amount of rooftop solar, as I said, so 17 gigawatts. And that's growing literally by several gigawatts a year. How do we effectively integrate those resources into the system? How do we make sure that those investments consumers are making are actually delivering not just energy to households, but are being used for broader energy use, but also system security services? And then what's that consumer journey look like for all of this? Because, you know, there are some consumers who are really well placed to invest in consumer energy resources, and there are others who are in energy inefficient homes and are struggling to make ends meet. So how do we help consumers through that journey? And then I would say there's one extra issue that people don't talk enough about, and that's how do you transition your gas pipeline network? So how do you start thinking about gas consumption and what that looks like, and how do you wind down a gas network, keeping in mind you might want to use bits of it for hydrogen. And when you wrap all those things together, I think there's probably enough challenges for now, but we can talk a bit more about them as we go.
Yeah, terrific overview, Claire. And I think, you know, very pertinent to emphasise the grid and the behind the meter generation, which are kind of truly unique features of the Australian system or the NEM, but also the challenges of the gas network. So given that overview, and again, for listeners who are less familiar with the Australian context, the Australian Energy Regulator has a series of different jobs, enforcing the rules of the wholesale electricity and gas markets in Australia, regulating networks and pipelines, including how much the network companies can charge customers. And the AER also protects consumers, and you started to talk about that there in that overview, by setting standing offers for retail customers in parts of the country as well. In some markets, the rulemaking role and I suppose the investigator enforcer role are combined. So my understanding is Ofgem in the UK is a little bit more like that. How would you explain the kind of governance structure in Australia to overseas listeners? And maybe touch a little bit on the state-federal split too, which, you know, adds significant complexity, I think, to the Australian context.
You say complexity, I say character. But, you know, it does basically, it is a different set of arrangements. But we do have, so if you think at the highest level, so it's a federal structure. So there's a federal government and there are state governments. And they constitutionally, the states technically have the responsibility for energy and the supply of energy, but we have an interconnected system. So there's obviously a role for the Australian government as well. And the way in which they've managed that is through really cooperative arrangements between the federal government and the state governments, which is very different to what you see like in somewhere like the US, for example. So we have actually got a system where all energy ministers, so both state, territory and federal, come together, you know, several times a year. They meet as a council of ministers and they agree the highest level policy, and they have legislated that. And that legislation is the National Electricity Law, the National Gas Law and the National Energy Retail Law. And that they are done through mirror legislation in all the different states and territories that are in the national electricity market. And they're also applied through the Commonwealth as well. So in that sense, we have consistent laws across all of the different jurisdictions. Now, there are state derogations and, you know, things that happen at that level, but by and large, the law is established federally. When they did set up what we call the market bodies, so the various players in the system, there was a lot of, I mean, I was actually involved in that 20 years ago, and there was lots of debate about the best way to do it. And certainly some of the discussions at the time talked about having regulation and rulemaking together. But there was a very clear view that it would be beneficial to not have, you know, the person who writes the rules being the one who enforces them. And that is a distinction we've made in our system, which is different to what you have in the UK. And so we have a system operator, which is the Australian Energy Market Operator. Their job is to physically dispatch plant and to run the market. So that is their job. That's an incorporated body, but it's owned by governments and the industry. We then have the Australian Energy Market Commission, and their job is to write rules and to amend the rules as anyone can come actually to the Australian Energy Market Commission and say, we think this rule should change and here's the reasons why, including us. And the Commission will assess that in the context of our overarching market objective. And then there's us, and our job is really to then enforce those rules, but also, the rules might be fairly high level at times. So we would issue guidance and guidelines to market participants. So there is a quasi rulemaking function in our space as well, because we do have to interpret those rules and give that guidance to the market. But yeah, we monitor the market as well. So we have that surveillance role. We do report on the market and its various operations very, very regularly. And then we also have a competition assessment role, and we have a role in, as you said, regulating the monopoly elements of it. We take enforcement action either by issuing infringement notices or going to the federal court. And then we also have a role in the consumer protection space. So both through the prices, but also through enforcing the retail law. So there is quite a range of things that we do, and we sort of largely structure ourselves around markets, networks, and compliance and enforcement. But yeah, it's a really interesting role. But it is an unusual governance framework. The other thing I should say is the three market bodies, so the Australian Energy Regulator, the Australian Energy Market Commission, and the Australian Energy Market Operator, we all work really closely together. So for the last few years, we've sat together on what was called the Energy Security Board. That's now been renamed the Energy Advisory Panel. But in that role, we would give advice to ministers. So we collectively sit down, there's market operation, there's rulemaking, there's regulation, and we bring our collective experience to the table, and we'll often give advice to ministers about the way forward. So I think it sounds and seems complex, but it does seem to work for us anyway.
Yeah, sometimes think energy governance is not a sexy topic, but it's super important, and it has big impacts in the way policy is designed and implemented. We ran briefly there through some of the AER's roles and responsibilities. During your time as chair, I suppose what's been the most challenging area, either because the decisions were contentious or because the stakes were particularly high, either politically or for consumers?
So our role has evolved a lot in the time that I've been there. One of the first things, and I'm a former head of corporate strategy at an energy utility, so, I walked in the door at the Australian Energy Regulator and said, well, where's the strategic plan? And so one of the first things we did is to develop a 5-year strategic plan, and that was really to look at how our role would change in the context of the transition. And so we've structured ourselves around 3 sort of distinct areas. One is how we execute. And so that's a lot of the stuff that we've always had to do and will always have to do, and we have to do it well. Then we've got a whole bunch of stuff that we call tilt priorities, and they're things where we have to sort of change the way we're doing it. We could do that. We don't need anyone else to empower us to do it, but where we need to start doing things a little bit differently. And then there are advocate priorities, and they're ones where we think we actually need changes to the law or the rules to enable us to do our job better. And so that really has guided, I guess, the way in which we've operated over the last 4 years that I've been chair. But we've also picked up a lot of new functions along the way. So, there have been changes in the way they want gas pipelines regulated, and we've picked up some form of regulation decisions under that. We've got increased gas market monitoring. So where we monitored the markets, we've gone a bit upstream. Now we've got to monitor production and reserves and storage. We've got new powers coming in on contract market monitoring. So that's our secondary markets. And so whilst we've always had oversight of those, we've not actually had access to all the underlying data. So that'll be a really new function for us as well, and really important when you think about the nature of competition in wholesale markets. So that's something that we think we can really add value on. Increasingly, our states and territories are doing different things around renewable energy investment. And so New South Wales, one of the biggest states, which is where Sydney is, they have basically been developing renewable energy zones. So they're sort of trying to look at where might there be scale efficient network extensions and expansions to actually house a whole lot of new renewables and develop the grid in a coordinated way. And so we've got a lot of new functions there, which are state-based, where normally we would be more in a federal system, but we're working both federally and with the states to help implement their plans. We've had, we've had interventions in coal markets, so we've been regulating coal mines recently. Lots of just DER or CER integration challenges and thinking about those in the distribution system. Social license has been a big issue for us. So they're kind of some of the newer functions. I probably should also say we're getting a new objective, but maybe we'll come back to that because that's an exciting one. But you asked me about some of the hardest decisions and the more challenging decisions, and there've been a few, and I guess probably the first really hard one. So I started in October 2019, and COVID obviously came February, March 2020. And, there was a few things that happened there. The first thing was to think about our role in consumer protection. And unlike lots of other places in the world, Australia went into long and hard lockdowns. And so we had a lot of people who weren't going to work, who were stuck in their homes, and obviously using a lot more energy and in some cases with less income. And so, we had to sort of think about and we were the first actually of any of the regulators or government bodies in Australia. And I don't know of anyone around the world who did a similar thing as quickly as we did. But we issued a statement of expectations to retailers and to network companies. And it was an interesting thing because it wasn't within our power to do that necessarily. But what we said is, this is what we expect of you at this time. And that was to not disconnect people while they were stuck at home, so that we didn't have people in their homes without energy. So we put a ban on disconnections. We put in place some changes to, what they could do around credit collections. We had a whole bunch. There was about 10 different things. And making the decision to do that, because we knew it would have implications for retailers, we knew it would have implications for customer debt levels, that decision was a really hard one. I think it was the right thing to do. And in fact, disconnections have never gone back to the level they were at pre-COVID. So it's had a structural change in the level of disconnections in the Australian system, but it was a big call to make at the time. I think similarly, we were making a big network decision right at the start of COVID. We had to make it, I think, at the end of April 2020, and we had to make an inflation forecast at that point. And so trying to think about what was happening with inflation and the best way to estimate it, and trimmed means and all these different sorts of things we were thinking about at the time was pretty tricky. But I think probably more recently, and we might get into it a little bit later, all the disruptions in energy markets last year, and Australia was not immune to that following the war in Ukraine. We had to start thinking about, what would happen to consumer prices in response to very high wholesale prices, and talking to governments, because we do set a retail price. And this is where my colleagues in Ofgem were fantastic. I mean, I was on the phone to Martin Cave, semi-regularly, and the Ofgem leadership, talking to them about what they were, and they were sort of 6 months in front of us in some ways, and it probably made us a little bit better prepared for some of the challenges that were coming in Australia. But we did lead a conversation with governments around whether or not there should be intervention in fuel markets to essentially shield the electricity system from some of those costs. And that did happen, and it did work. So we did see price increases this year, but, at one point we thought they were going to be as high as 50%, and they were much more sort of 20 to 25%. And so that's been obviously really challenging, and something that, we've had to work through. And probably the last one I'd touch on, if I've got time for one more to say, a challenging decision. I'm looking for a sign that you want to shut me up, but is that in recent months, we've had to take a decision on 3 of the gas distribution businesses in Victoria. And one of the tricky things when you're an infrastructure regulator and you're thinking about something like gas pipeline network is, how quickly do you allow networks to recover their costs? So what's the rate of depreciation through time? And, when you start to think that maybe a pipeline network won't be there in 80 years, and often gas pipelines are depreciated over 50 to 80 years, depending on the nature of the equipment, starting to accelerate that, because there are risks, obviously, to future consumers who are still consuming off the network if they're left with all the costs of the fixed network. So making that balance between the impact that has on today's prices versus, making sure we start to tackle that big problem. but also looking at the way in which the cost of disconnection is recovered, because I don't know if you have this in other places around the world, but a temporary gas disconnection costs about $70. A permanent gas disconnection costs about $1,000 because they have to dig in and cap it at your street. And one of the things we were starting to see is that customers who were actually permanently disconnecting from the gas system were choosing temporary disconnection because that's cheaper. And so, everybody loves a good economic incentive. And so we were worried that by making those user pays so different in price, that essentially we were causing a safety issue, because the safety regulator's concern is that they don't want all these live gas assets left in the ground. And so we made the decision to actually reduce the distance between the temporary and permanent disconnection. So we went to sort of a $220 permanent, and we had to socialise the rest. Now that had a big impact on prices as well. So some are thinking through those challenges, and no one in the world, and I meet with world regulators all the time, no one's really started to think about this and do those things. So might be boring for non-energy nerds, but this is Energy Unplugged. So put it out.
Yeah, you've got a very sympathetic audience here, Claire.
Hopefully.
We might zoom out a moment and just cover something that's a little bit more of a almost philosophical debate in Australia at the moment, which is really around going beyond efficiency, and particularly as this relates to the energy transition. And I know there's a lot to unpack in that two-word slogan, but broadly, the underlying idea is that regulators should be increasing their focus on things like urgency and reducing emissions, even if this comes at the expense of some efficiency gains. And I think we saw this discussed recently at the AER's regulatory conference in Brisbane. So could you perhaps trace the evolution of this debate for us and outline what a beyond efficiency agenda might look like for Australia's energy governance community?
Sure. I mean, I don't know that it's a settled. If you were at the conference, you would have seen that there's a lot of debate, even within my own board and within the ACCC Commission, for example, about what this even means. But I think, it's interesting when you think about, I'm an economist, right? Originally by training, that's where I come from. That's my discipline. But beyond efficiency really presumes a very narrow view of efficiency, I probably should say too. So when you actually, if you're an economic thought, and if you're an economist, the training would tell you efficiency is about maximising welfare, right? And it has lots of dimensions to it. So there's productive, allocative, dynamic efficiencies. But I think when you look at the way in which sometimes efficiency is used, we look at the things we can measure, or the things we can easily measure. And we probably become overly hung up on productive efficiency. And so we kind of don't turn as much attention to allocative and dynamic efficiency. And so I think personally, this debate is really it's really about saying you can't look at efficiency so narrowly, and that you need to be thinking about the full suite of dimensions that sit within the efficiency argument. Whereas some would say, no, it's efficiency out the window, right? I genuinely don't think it can be that, because I think one of the things you've got to think about is, at what point would you say you don't want to be efficient? Of course you want to be efficient, but it's a means to an end, which is really about maximising welfare, and it does have distributive implications. So it's not, and that allocative efficiency is important in that context, and we do need to be investing in innovation, and urgency is important from a dynamic efficiency perspective. But wellbeing budgets, that's not a new thing, right? So when you go back to the way in which, I originally worked in the virtual treasury, as Hugo said at the start, they had a wellbeing framework 20 years ago. And a wellbeing framework was about saying it's not just about GDP or GDP per capita. What are the other things we're interested in? We're interested in looking at risk. We're interested in looking at choice. So there's a bunch of things you really want to consider, complexity. All of these elements are important when you're starting to think about how you want to make policy. And I think, to your point, what does it mean for us? Like, I look at it and say, when we designed the electricity system, we probably were overly focused on productive efficiency. So we wanted to make sure that it was super efficient, but in the process, we made something incredibly complex. And anyone who's a behavioural economist will know that that creates a whole bunch of barriers and inefficiencies simply by the fact that people can't properly engage and they can't necessarily make rational choices in that context. And so when I talk about, I don't actually ever talk about beyond efficiency, but if I was to talk about beyond efficiency, I'd be talking more about making sure we're thinking about things from a much broader perspective. And even when you think about our own objectives, everything we do in the energy system is guided by the overarching energy objectives. And that is really efficient investment in and efficient operation and use of essentially energy services, such that, but with respect to price, safety, security, quality, and emissions is coming into that as well. And our job as a regulator is to balance all of those things in the long-term interests of consumers. And so to say that we would just be focused on the price outcome, or we'd be just focused on, a narrower safety outcome or something, we have to always, and we will have to do it with emissions as well, balance all of these things up to make sure we can meet the long-term interests of consumers. Now, I think that's still an efficiency test from my perspective, but it's a broad test, right? So, yeah.
For sure. And I mean, that the fact that emissions is coming in, and it's been discussed for quite a while, and it does represent a reasonably big shift in the landscape, potentially, having a new dimension to the objectives. Are you able to speak at all at the moment about how you guys are thinking about, functionally incorporating that into your decision making?
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, like we've sort of gone through, as good regulators would, and we've looked at every single place under the rules where we have to make decisions based on the objectives, so we can look at all the places where we would legally need to do that. But probably, and we've put out a first guidance note or 2 guidance notes already on this. It really comes down to some very clear network things where it's fairly obviously involved. So when you start to think about the cost-benefit analysis for a big transmission investment, so we call that a regulatory investment test, or for a distribution investment. If you're thinking about augmenting the distribution system because you want to put more solar in, rooftop solar into the system, there are a whole lot of things. So, we have a guideline which is around valuing customer exports, so customer export curtailment values. So you're looking at that trade-off between investing in the system and turning off solar. And in that, there will be embedded an emissions cost effectively. And so what we are expecting to get from the energy ministers over the next couple of months is a value of emissions reduction. And that will give us, I think, a quantitative value that we can use in weighing up some of these choices. So we've already seen in one of the distribution proposals that we've had in recently from a large distributor in New South Wales, Ausgrid, they included a carbon value in their proposal. So they were using that to weigh up their choices and to make a benefits case for new investment. And that's a really obvious way in which we would start to think about valuing emissions.
Yep.
It'll have lots of other implications as well, but they're just probably a couple of very obvious ones.
Yep. And I take it looking for guidance from the government there on the value, given that we don't have sort of an explicit carbon pricing framework, it's a little bit more going to have to be policy driven. I think we've covered on the challenges, and you listed an enormous range of challenges the AER has tried to solve. Maybe to focus on the positives, what do you think Australia is doing well through the energy transition? I mean, we mentioned rooftop solar story and almost 3 gigawatts a year being added at the moment. So there's that. There's also the way that Australia does have locational signals for investment, and we use those in particular through marginal loss factors in Australia and the risk of curtailment to try and ensure investment in the right places, which is quite a different approach to the UK, for example. Of all of the things that Australia is currently doing, where do you think we've got an edge over the other countries of the world?
Look, I genuinely think the integrated system plan was a first. Like when I look at some of the other countries around the world, I don't see the same sort of planning happening, and it is. So I feel like that's a fairly unique edge we have, and so our integrated system plan is really a plan out to 2050 that looks at using scenario analysis, but looks at the grid development, but also the generation that's likely to come in, and I think that has been a real change from sort of the regionally based plans to get that into place. So I think that's a real strength and has driven much longer term thinking and more coordinated investment thinking across the grid. So I think that's a really good thing. I think you're right, rooftop solar is something we've done remarkably well, probably better than we anticipated. It's caused some challenges as well, but we've also done really big, large-scale batteries well, right, too. We've had every new battery seems to be the biggest battery in the Southern Hemisphere, so we're integrating them in, not just for energy, but also for system integrity protection. So we're seeing 6 batteries in the transmission system as well. I think we've also managed that integration of renewables and the volume of them, particularly if you think about South Australia, which is sort of at the end of the line in our system. We've done system operation really well. And that's a credit to the Australian Energy Market Operator that they've been able to keep the lights on. Sometimes they have resources disappear at a moment's notice and back again in terms of solar and even wind in South Australia. But, they're running a system there which is almost 100% renewables, or is 100% renewables at some time. We're seeing minimum demand levels which are very low in South Australia for long periods of time. And I think system operation, we're teaching the world on system operation, and I think that is a really great thing. We've also been on the front foot really around developing our essential system security markets, so particularly for frequency control ancillary services and some of the fast response markets there. I think we have looked a lot at system strength, which is really about stable voltage waveforms and how we maintain those through the transition. I think we, as a country, have ample solar and wind resources, so it should be a competitive advantage for us, and getting into that and getting that investment unlocked is really critical. Tariff reform is something we probably don't talk a lot about, but we are seeing a lot more retailers or customers exposed to time of use network tariffs, and that's important. Again, nerdy topic, but if we don't do that properly, particularly as we start to see electric vehicles rolled out, the risk is that we'll have to build a much larger grid than what we otherwise would have, because we'll be augmenting the thing to have peaks at weird times of the day. So ensuring we've got cost-reflective price signals to particularly those big loads is really important as well. I disagree with you on your comment about locational signals, though. I think, marginal loss factors are not a great way to manage investment, and I think we don't have very good signals to generation about where to invest in the transmission system. So I think, if you're making a generation investment, you're interested in wind speed and you're interested in solar radiation, but it'd be really good if you're also super interested in where there's grid capacity. So I think we could do better on sending stronger locational signals to new investment. And certainly it is something the UK is looking at the moment as well.
Yeah, maybe to your point about measuring what matters, maybe we think it's a good signal because we forecasted and are looking at them every day. A bit of insight based.
Most investors will tell you they've lost their shirts over it, so I'm not sure it's a great signal.
Awesome. So at the time that we're recording this podcast, the AER has just released its annual flagship State of the Energy Market report, which I think is the 15th year in a row that you guys have put that out. And for some of our listeners, they'll be familiar with how tumultuous the 2022 energy market was in Australia. But could you perhaps explain a bit about the events of last year, what's changed in 2023 in the latest report, and the outlook for the year ahead?
Yeah, look, so I think for context, given this is an international podcast, our last year was bad, but maybe not as bad as some others. It felt bad to us, but I think, when I think about the year Ofgem had, I shouldn't complain. But we did have essentially a situation where very sharp increases in coal and gas prices. And in part, for your listeners, it's important to point out we are a massive exporter of gas and coal. But we are interconnected to those markets, and a number of our generators were at the margin exposed to spot prices in Australia, and so those spot prices obviously link to international prices, and from that perspective we imported a crisis. So even though we don't in any way rely on energy supplies from Russia, we were certainly importing those high fossil fuel prices. We also saw really quite concerning levels of reliability in our fossil fuel plant. So we had a lot of outages at our coal-fired power stations. We had just a really bad flooding season, so we had some of our own coal mines were flooded, and we had some weather, which meant we had less wind and solar available. And then we had a really cold start to winter. So it was, not enough supply, lots of demand, really high fuel prices. And so our market has some automatic features to it because it is an energy-only market, and the price can fluctuate between minus 1,000 and 15,000 basically every 5 minutes. And so when we see very high prices over a week and you get a cumulative price threshold is reached, there is an automatic response that triggers in, and there's a cap of $300. Now, that $300 cap was probably lower than some of the short-run marginal costs of some of the generators, so they were pulling out and not bidding. And so then our system operator suspended the market altogether. And we had a hairy couple of weeks. So there were sharp increases in the contract price of energy. So the spot market was obviously high, but the derivative markets were high as well. We had some margin calls happening through essentially through the stock exchange. There were some very exposed retailers, some of whom closed, but only very small ones. So, we did lose about 8 retailers, I think, through the course of last year. And we've got 40 or something, just so that everyone's aware. It wasn't like it was most of the market, and not very many consumers were affected by it. What's changed? So I mentioned earlier that there was an intervention by all governments into the fuel market. So we had a $12 a gigajoule cap put on the gas price. We also had a gas contract price. We also had $125 a tonne coal cap put in place. And these things helped to stabilise effectively the prices that generators were paying for fuel into the electricity market. It didn't affect exports. Everything else kept chugging along. It didn't prevent exports, but it just meant that we had that coal and gas available for our system and at lower prices. And so that has stabilised, and we saw a significant fall in secondary markets, so the future price of electricity when those came in. We also have seen this winter a much more benign weather. We had effectively a very mild winter. Plant performance was better, and so we really have had a very benign wholesale market environment through the course of 2023. Summer, is always hard. We've got a lot of bushfires forecast that can affect generation and transmission assets, and so we need to be on watch, I guess, from that perspective. But at this stage, things look okay. It's the next year doesn't. If you look at forward markets, they don't look particularly troubled. They're relatively flat. But I think there are some vulnerabilities in the system, and new investment is something that we're really quite keen to see being unlocked. And I think the transmission upgrades are a big enabler of that as well. So for us to continue to see kind of a more stable environment, we really need to see that new investment happening.
Yeah, definitely. Particularly as I think the coal caps run out midway through 2024. The gas price cap will be reviewed midway through 25. So do want to see that additional supply come in, just hopefully continue to see stability in prices when those roll off. Claire, we mentioned earlier that the AER exists to ensure that consumers are better off both now and into the future. And part of the State of the Energy Market report speaks to the progress the AER has made in progressing some of the actions from its consumer vulnerability strategy, which is called Towards Energy Equity. Can you tell us a bit more about this strategy and the actions that you've taken and continue to take, and the AER's approach overall to ensuring consumers are at the heart of its work?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think this is something where and it's interesting, it's probably a bit relevant to the conversation we're having about beyond efficiency as well. But when we started to think about the experience of and the lived experience of consumers, and particularly consumers who experience vulnerability, we could see that, there's a bunch of things. Complexity is a barrier to their participation, and in fact can induce vulnerability. It's not just about financial hardship. It can be about access, disability, mental health events, and all of us are in some way vulnerable to this happening at some point in our life. And so, we need to design a system that actually enables people to be supported through that period of vulnerability, because it is people can come in and out of it. Some of it is obviously ongoing, but people can come in and out of it, and enable them to get back on their feet and back into the system. So I think what we did is we had looked around the world, and we had some work done and saw what other regulators around the world were doing in this space, and decided to embark on doing a strategy to look at how we would protect consumers experiencing vulnerability. We came up with a plan, and there were 14 actions in it, and those 14 actions, there are 15 now, but there were 14 actions when we finished the plan at the first stage. They were really around trying to improve the identification of vulnerability, trying to reduce complexity and enhance the accessibility of the market, trying to strengthen protections for consumers experiencing payment difficulty, ensuring that the consumer voice and the lived experience is included in regulatory design and change, and also looking to try and make sure that we're as efficient as possible in our regulation, so cut that cost to retailers to serve energy consumers so that we can improve affordability. But we kind of got to all 14 of them, and there's lots of really great stuff in there, right? So, we've done a Better Bills guideline, which has just started, which requires retailers to keep the front page of their bill in particular quite simple, to include a message that tells them whether they're on the best plan for their circumstances. We've put in place family violence protections, where customers are no longer required to provide evidence of family violence, which is something that was causing trauma to people in retailers, but also to customers themselves. We've upgraded our Energy Made Easy comparison website, which actually helps consumers to shop around. But, even when we looked at everything we were planning to do, all 14 actions, we kind of got to the end of them and went, even if we do all of these really well, it's probably not going to massively change the dial for people who are experiencing vulnerability. And so we have spent the last year or so working with about 50 odd organisations to see whether we can change the game. It's a big, bold thing to say, to come up with a game changer, but we are looking at how we might be able to, and this is a great example of a really efficient system. When we designed it so that retailers would, do the things that you would expect a commercial entity to do. They go and pay their suppliers, so they pay the generators, they pay all the network businesses, and then we gave them the tools to manage essentially that bad debt, and that's disconnection. And you don't do that in the UK, right? Like, you don't disconnect customers for non-payment, but you can disconnect customers for non-payment in Australia. And the net result of that means that we have customers who live without energy. And so, we stood back from that and said, is that really the system we want? I mean, we're not banning disconnections, but, can we get to a place where we look at how we might better support retailers? Because how can they sort of share that cost and risk of managing these consumers more widely across the sector? And how can we help them to therefore be incentivised to identify customers earlier and to provide a better service? And so that's a piece of work we've been doing that we're taking to ministers soon. But I think the thing I want to make is, when you think about a transition, consumers who are experiencing vulnerability and particularly through financial disadvantage, they tend to live in the least energy efficient homes. They tend to have the least access to upgrading those homes because they're usually renters. And they tend to have the least ability to actually access the benefits of the transition, so things like solar and batteries. And so they're most caught in the cycle. They have the biggest bills, both because they have the highest energy use, and then they also have the lowest amount of income. So I think being able to take those consumers on this journey and not leave them behind is a really important part of how we make it an effective transition to net zero emissions.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a particularly striking chart in the State of the Energy Market report, seeing the most vulnerable consumers using so much energy, just not intuitively what you would expect, but a very serious outcome.
Yeah, well, most of them have got 1-star energy homes, right? It's like living in a tent.
I've certainly lived in a number of houses in Melbourne with single glazed windows, and they're absolutely freezing all through winter.
No insulation as well, and sometimes cracks in walls and floorboards and roof tiles missing, and
all of that.
It is like living in a tent. Yeah.
Might jump to a topic that I know the AR is quite passionate about, which is supporting innovation. And so you guys have your Energy Innovation Toolkit, which commenced in 2022. And by the time this episode is released, that toolkit will have released its inaugural year in review and potentially announced its first trial waiver decision. Could you tell us a little bit more about this work and the role that you see for innovation through the transition?
Yeah, so look, I made a joke at that conference that you were talking about before, James, where I said, we might not be beyond efficiency, but we're certainly beyond our comfort zone when you start asking regulators to become innovative. But I think we've done a good job of it in the sense that what we've been asked to do is establish a regulatory sandbox. And so that's an opportunity for anyone who might have a new business model or might have some customer offering that will support the transition, but is unsure about how to navigate the regulatory framework. So we're providing a lot of toolkits and inquiry service so that they can get advice on how to navigate that. But we also have the ability to waive the rules. So in a protected environment, and that's been a very recent thing. And so you're right, we've got our very first waiver that I think is getting released today or tomorrow. So by the time you go to air, it'll be out. But it's really that one was for Endeavour Energy, and it's to enable them to actually roll out 5,600 smart meters to enable load management services. Normally that's done by retailers, but they had a proposition, and it will include them doing innovation reporting, and so everybody gets transparency around what they learn. But it does enable them to do that and trial that without having to go through the normal rules process. But we've had quite a lot of inquiries. We've had 40 inquiries. We've had quite a number of proponents, I think 6 at the moment, who are either in pre-trial or trial stage. We've had like nearly 8,000 people got like unique website visits in terms of it, and 451 people have come to us wanting help to navigate all of this. So another one where Ofgem were great, because Ofgem's actually done this before, and so we did a lot of pre-engagement with them and learnt some of their lessons. So it's actually gone relatively smoothly, but probably thanks to our colleagues at Ofgem, I'd say.
That's super cool and great to see the Australian Energy Regulator supporting innovation in that way. 2 kind of quick rapid fire questions to finish up on that we tried to ask all guests. The first one, what's one out of consensus view that you hold on the future of the energy transition? So somewhere you think you're at odds with conventional wisdom.
Interesting to ask an energy regulator to talk about where they're out of odds with everyone else. But look, and so it's not that I have a different view, it's that I have a question about whether or not competition will look in the future like it does now. So we very much, and I should say the structure of our system is not like the US, for example, where there's a lot of vertical integration. We have taken a view of disaggregating every element of our supply chain. And so it's been very much based on horizontal competition in generation and retail with the monopoly infrastructure regulated. But I'm starting to wonder whether we'll see, off-grid and on-grid competition. So you might get more vertical competition, and, what does that mean? We have separated distribution and retail, and for good reason, but, in the future, does, some of the stuff that you see that happens in California, for example, is only possible because they have that integrated. I'm not advocating for that change, to be clear. I'm just saying I have a question in my mind about whether competition will always look as it does now, and whether we need to be open-minded to what it might look like in the future.
No, super interesting. And to some degree, that Californian model was a bit of an accident of history, because they were planning further deregulation and the Enron stuff broke. So almost an accident of policy there. So then the final question, who do you read or listen to that you think is always good or thought-provoking and relevant to your work as a regulator?
So I feel like you want me to say Energy Unplugged, but I would say that some of my board colleagues do listen to Energy Unplugged. But it's not that I don't. But, who do I listen to that's good, thought-provoking and relevant to my work? My stakeholders. So, I talk about energy, or I'm reading about energy literally all day, every day, and some nights. But where I tend to get the most insight is from talking to our stakeholders, so consumers, first and foremost, but then also the industry as well, obviously, and governments and other market bodies. But listening to stakeholders when you're a regulator is probably the most important thing you can do.
That's a great way to finish up, and completely agree. You've been extremely generous with your time. A huge thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Hugo. Great to be here with you.
That was Clare Savage, Chair of the Australian Energy Regulator, talking to Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in APAC, and James Ha, Aurora's Head of Research in Australia. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.